and welcome to all of you joining us today to mark and discuss UN Security Council Resolution 1325 on the 20th anniversary of its signing. My name is Michelle Quinn, and I will be moderating today's discussion. Resolution 1325 was signed on October 31st of 2000. The resolution acknowledged the disproportionate and unique impact of armed conflict on women and girls. It recognized the undervalued and underutilized contributions of women that they can make in conflict prevention, peacekeeping, conflict resolution, and peace building. And it stressed the importance of women's equal and full participation as active agents in peace and security. So, how far have women now been brought into peace building processes? And how have public, private, and civic sectors helped or hindered women's participation? Today, we have a distinguished panel of leaders from civil society, government, academia, and the private sector who will share their thoughts on this subject and who will take your questions in the latter part of our time together. So let me start by introducing our panelists today. First, Lorraine Anderson is Chief of Staff to Jacqueline O'Neill, Canadian Ambassador for Women, Peace, and Security. Prior to this, Lorraine was the first Secretary for Legal Affairs at Canada's permanent mission to the United Nations in Geneva. Lorraine is an international lawyer with 20 years of experience providing strategic, legal, and policy guidance to governments, NGOs, and intergovernmental organizations in the areas of international law, international relations, and foreign policy. She is a subject matter expert on issues related to women, peace and security, and gender equality across post-conflict and development settings. Sahana Dharmapuri is the director of Our Secure Future. For the past 2 decades, Sahana has advised senior level policymakers and military officials on how to promote peace and stability in theaters of conflict around the world. She believes that the greatest security innovation of the 21st century is not new technology, but applying the principle of gender equality to peace and security decision-making. Sahana has published widely on issues of women, peace, and security, including a book entitled Women, Peace, and Security, 10 Things You Should Know. Next, Sanam Naraghi-Anderlini is the founder and executive director of the International Civil Society Action Network, or ICAN. Sanam has over 2 decades of experience as a peace strategist, working globally on conflicts, crises, and violent extremism with a mix of civil society, governments, and the United Nations. At ICAN, she spearheads the Women's Alliance for Security Leadership, comprising independent women-led organizations in more than 40 nations who focus on preventing violence, promoting peace, issues of rights, and pluralism. And David Smith is Associate Professor of Sociology in the National Security Affairs Department at the United States Naval War College. A former Navy pilot and squadron commander, David trained in military sociology and social psychology. He focuses his research on gender, work, and family issues, including bias in performance evaluations, retention of women, dual career families, and women in the military. David is the author of numerous publications, including his just released book, co-authored with Brad Johnson, entitled Good Guys: How Men Can Be Better Allies for Women in the Workplace. And as I mentioned, I'm Michelle Quinn. I'm with Patriot Group International, a US company that provides stabilization assistance, contingency support, and security services in complex and sometimes fragile regions across the globe. PGI is a member of the International Code of Conduct Association, and I was recently elected to serve on the board of directors of ICoCA, representing the security industry pillar. I also serve as chairman of the Women, Peace, and Security Working Group of ICoA, the International Stability Operations Association, which in 2020 established a WPS certification program. That program now has more than 120 corporate and individual participants. Those enrolled are actively engaged in learning about the imperatives of women, peace, and security, and in earning a WPS certification. So I'd like to begin by asking each panelist to take a few minutes to discuss the initiatives you're representing and working on. I'd like you, particularly if you can, to focus on what the last 20 years has taught you about the challenges to ensuring women's representation and inclusion. Sanam, can you start for us?
Sure. Thank you very much for having me with you today. It's a big moment in some ways. I was involved in mobilizing civil society globally and actually drafting our version of what became Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security, starting in 1999, and then getting it, doing the lobbying and the advocacy to get governments on board with us. I would start with a couple of things. I mean, we often think about this as sort of starting from the standpoint of women, but it starts from the standpoint of conflict prevention. It starts from the standpoint of women in war zones, women who were survivors and victims of sexual violence and the horrors of war, women who are peace builders and continue to be peace builders, and also women who were political actors and even armed actors. You know, they're part of militias and liberation movements especially. And back in 1998, we had the first conference globally of women and war, and seeing that whether they're in El Salvador or in Israel, frankly, there is a universality of experience. And women are, it's not that all of a sudden this resolution was passed and now women are active. Women are always active. Women are always present. Women are doing the peace building work. COVID, women have been the first responders and the ones to run to the problem. Whenever there's a crisis, you get a cohort of women who run to the problem to address it. The idea behind the resolution was to give recognition to that, give recognition to the fact that there is this diversity and these voices. And what comes from women very strongly is that violence should not be the first option. In fact, violence really should be way down the list, and that we have the capacity as people and the majority of us, I think, to understand that you can sit down and resolve your conflicts non-violently through negotiations, through dialogue, etc. And that's the way we should be. That's the tilt that we should have, as opposed to the literally the past 20 years, certainly, where we, from the United States standpoint, it's been if we don't like someone, let's go to war with them. If we can't go to war, let's sanction them. If we can't sanction them and get rid of them, then maybe we'll sit at the table. It should be flipped. It should be we negotiate. What the perspective of women is, violence should really not be an option. War is not inevitable. War is entirely in our control at any given moment. And bringing it to the private sector side of the story, I would say two things. One, peace is not a political issue. What I found over the years is that the private sector has been very reluctant to engage in this agenda. Somehow they think that this is politics. No, peace is the baseline. Peace is the, it's like giving a Picasso paints to say, paint us a masterpiece, but giving him a torn canvas. If you don't have peace, and everything else you do falls through the holes, right? So enabling the private sector to be involved in this sector, in this work, is really important. And then secondly, there's an assumption that war is good for business. Actually, it's not. War is good for a handful of companies that sell weapons, but for the rest of the world of private sector business, media, culture, arts, industry, et cetera, peace is good. You need a peaceful, tourism. And so thinking about shifting these and taking away the kind of Wizard of Ozzery that in a way captures national security conversations and conversations around peace and security. This is what this agenda did, because it said, we as women want to come into these spaces. We're going to bust open the walls of the council and sit there and ask the questions. What do you mean that security has to be military? No, security is also PPEs and masks, for example. We were having these conversations 20 years ago on other issues, other kinds of health issues and environmental issues, but it resonates because what we say is actually was prescient then, but it's just relevant constantly when you look at the world from the human perspective and the lens of people affected on the ground, men, women, or children. Thank you.
Thank you, Sanam. Sahana?
Thanks, Michelle. It's really a pleasure to be here today with my co-panelists, and thanks, Sanam, for that great starting us off on that conversation. You know, as my colleague stated, we've had 20 years of this agenda, and we know that peace has a better chance when women are included and can make decisions about their own lives. But I think, you know, what I'd like to start off talking about is the fact that we don't do enough in terms of implementation, and that's where we're really falling behind as a community of practice. But also, what is ICoCA's role in that? What kind of role could ICoCA members play in the furthering of the women, peace, and security agenda? So first, you might say, why should ICoCA care about gender or women, peace, and security, gender equality? And I think there's three really important reasons. One is operational effectiveness. It will absolutely increase your, as a company, providing security services in a range of places, your operational effectiveness. And there are real problems on the ground that Sanam alluded to that really do need to be addressed by a multi-stakeholder approach, like preventing sexual and gender-based violence and other forms of abuse, really addressing the discrimination of female hires in the security sector, and also the prevalence and the use of small arms and light weapons and domestic violence in a lot of the countries in which ICoCA members operate in. So that's the first one, operational effectiveness. The second one is accountability. We can collectively increase the accountability and transparency of the work that we're doing in these environments using the Women, Peace, and Security framework. And there's a couple of areas that really matter that I think ICoCA could make a big difference in. One is in contracts, and the second is in addressing third-party nationals and their behaviors if they go off the rails. And I'll get to that later when I talk a little bit about tactics, or maybe we'll have a conversation about that later. And the third point I want to make, which kind of circles back to something Sanam started with, is dignity. I think, you know, we have to approach our security as nothing about us without us, and that includes everybody. We can't have security, our own security, at the expense of other people's security. So, you know, a hallmark of a successfully secure, stable environment and operational effectiveness is a peaceful environment that has mutual respect and consistent dialogue with all the stakeholders to solve problems. So I think then the question is, how can ICoCA members actually take action on women, peace, and security? And I think ICoCA really does have a critical role to play in this area for three reasons. One is the ICoCA network seems to be multi-stakeholder in its approach to problem solving, which is exactly what Women, Peace, and Security encourages in terms of dialogue across sectors. With civil society, with private sector, with government actors, right? It's really one of the reasons that I love the Women, Peace, and Security agenda, is that I'm part of a diverse community by design. And I want to just actually give a shout out to one of my friends and colleagues at Gender Force, which is a women's security organization that is nonprofit that works with military organizations. It's a great example, and they have really innovative approaches to addressing things on the ground. The second is, like the ICoCA Code of Conduct, the Women, Peace, and Security agenda is really firmly rooted in international humanitarian law and international human rights law, right? So we're all about protection of civilians, the full and meaningful participation of marginalized groups in decision-making about their security, and many, many other things like prevention, et cetera. And then third, the code of conduct that ICoCA has adopted and its members participate in upholding is really a commitment to a normative behavior, right? It's a human rights-based approach to security. That is what we're doing collectively when we commit to codes like this. And this is why I really think ICoCA is perfectly positioned to create new tools and standards, perhaps through a certification or something like that, that integrates gender and women, peace, and security much more effectively. So these are all great ideas, and you guys might be asking, well, how would we actually do this? And I do have some specific ideas, which we could talk about later, but just briefly, the three actions that really guide us in women, peace, and security implementation that ICoCA can adopt are, one is training our members on how to conduct gender analysis, and how do we integrate that into our pre-planning before you get into a country? How do we work with civil society, secondly, in holding a commitment to those things that we find in our gender analysis? And that requires regular and meaningful consultation with civil society, even when that is difficult and uncomfortable. And then thirdly, I think taking a really good look at increasing women's roles in decision-making positions at all levels of decision-making. And that, again, like we were talking about before earlier, that this is not just about women, this is about everyone. And senior leaders, particularly men in senior level positions, have a big role to play in championing these processes, these tools, and also the inclusion of more women into this sector. So I'm just going to leave with one thing that might be a little provocative, which is before jumping out of the frying pan into the fire and in doing this, I think that we do have to address some real problems that I think the ICoCA community can solve. I'll say, for one thing, in preparation for this panel, I noticed that a lot of the work that's been done over the last 20 years on gender equality in extractive industries, for example, or IFIs or private security sectors, has literally sort of disappeared from the web. I went back to look at my old colleagues' work and find, to look up old toolkits and documented case studies and things that really worked. And it was surprising to me that a lot of these things are no longer available on the web. Now, I think this is something the ICoCA membership could really contribute to, because I know you're a mix of civil society, private sector, government actors. Building up these resources for people online is a super important role to play. And then I think I'll just end on this, that when we talk about women and gender equality, this is not just about adding women and stir, right? Like that, the saying, don't just add women and stir. That's not the exercise we're trying to be engaged in with women, peace, and security. So I will end there, and just on the note of just saying, I really think women, peace, and security after 20 years just has shown us how practical it is in its approach. It's not theoretical, but it really requires us to take action in some specific sets of ways. It requires us also to change our behavior and work together to make these changes. So I hope that's, a conversation we can have. Thank you.
Thank you, Sahana. Lorraine, are you on, and can you speak at this time?
I am back on. Apologies, I had some technical difficulties.
No problem.
So thanks very much, Michelle. Thank you. And I also want to thank ICoCA for choosing to prioritize this issue of women, peace, and security as we celebrate the 20th anniversary of the resolution this week. And I'm also honored to be included on the panel to share these perspectives of how exactly we can effectively promote peace building through public, private, and nonprofit participation. And while I will be highlighting some of Canada's initiatives and some elements of Canada's approach, I am here in my personal capacity, and so I'm not going to be speaking on behalf of the government of Canada. And even though I was cut out for a bit, I do know that Sanam has already given us a bit of a solid background on the resolution and the wider framework. So I'm not going to go into detail on that, but I wouldn't mind just doing a couple of contextual points before I get into the meat of what I wanted to say. And it's first, as was stressed previously, but I think it's important to note again, that civil society was instrumental in developing this ambitious agenda. And its continued involvement in how it evolves and how it meets evolving challenges is super important. And by civil society, I am talking about women peace builders and their organizations. As Sanam said, they are the ones who took it to the Security Council before member states in order to establish this resolution and the framework and the agenda that we're working with right now. And the second is something that Sahara just mentioned, is that we're dealing with a lot of myths and misunderstandings of what the agenda is about. And so before we can see the linkages and the opportunities of where the WPS agenda and where there's opportunities for collaboration between and among public, private, and nonprofit sectors, I think it's important to be clear about what the agenda is actually about. And it's a transformative agenda that spans the development, humanitarian, and peace and security spectrums. And so we're, as was referenced previously, we're reconceptualizing the peace table to focus on peace builders and peace builders, and not just the warring parties. And so in addition to some of the other myths, it's like, you know, women are not more inherently more peaceful, and we're definitely not trying to make war safer for women. It's also not about, although we think Canada thinks it's an important aspect, it's not just about getting more women into the police and military, or in terms of private security, getting more women on employed as security personnel. So now that we have that, that's what it's not. I think I would like to focus a little bit too, is that during the time of this international pandemic and we have some global instability, this is a really great time to elevate the WPS agenda, because it not only highlights the particular and serious challenges that are manifested during the pandemic and instability, but I would also argue it holds some of the answers and potential solutions that can guide some of our responses, and that could be taken into consideration in further discussions on this topic later on in our conversations. So, and the fourth thing I want to note is that while the normative framework is strong, progress on implementation has been slow. And some of the progress that we have achieved actually is in jeopardy. And so this is the environment that we're working in. And so just to give a couple of examples from the Canadian perspective, is that Canada is one of 85 countries that have a national action plan to implement the resolution. And most multilateral organizations, for example, the AU, OSCE, NATO, et cetera, have plans or policies to do the same thing. And so in Canada, we're coming up upon the midterm review of our second national action plan, which is called Gender Equality, a Foundation for Peace, and it's for the period 2017 to 2022. And it's a whole of government approach. So we have 8 government departments, including the Royal Canadian Mounted Police as implementing partners. And so we don't just have the external facing departments, for example, Global Affairs and Department of Defense, but we also have some internal facing partners as well. I won't list them all in the interest of time, but if anybody's interested, I could put those in the chat. The 5 key objectives of the National Action Plan is to increase the meaningful participation of women pre, during, and post-conflict, to prevent and respond to SGBV, and to end impunity for SGBV, to promote and protect human rights, as well as to address sexual rights and access to sexual and reproductive health services in humanitarian settings, and also to strengthen the capacity of peace operations to advance that agenda. And another initiative that we have in Canada is the mandate for the Ambassador for Women, Peace and Security, for whom I work. Just over a year ago, Prime Minister Trudeau appointed Jacqueline O'Neill as Canada's Ambassador for Women, Peace and Security for a 3-year term through an order in council. And one of her key responsibilities is to provide confidential assessments and advice to ministers engaged on the National Action Plan, so that's 9 of them, and also on how Canada can continue to demonstrate leadership on the global plane. And so it's a role more of a force multiplier, because we have a lot of action taking place domestically with various departments on the WPS agenda. So it's not to duplicate that, but it's to multiply the effects of those efforts. And so the ambassador and her team are focusing on 2 main areas: comprehensive implementation of the National Action Plan and broadened implementation of the agenda writ large. And so I'm going to end this portion of my participation. Just again, I want to stress a few things of our opportunities now that we're facing the pandemic, in that it's exposing the extent of the inequalities in our communities, particularly Indigenous communities. It's galvanized the recognition and the need to address systemic racism in institutions around the world. And we can discuss what that means for the WPS agenda, as well as for ICoCA members, as well as a timely reminder of what we need, and that is an intersectional approach to the WPS agenda. And to do so effectively, to take that intersectional approach, what we need is gender and race disaggregated data, and to use it to expand our understanding of what is required to make people feel secure, greater than the absence of war. So there are windows of positive change, and the challenge is now upon of us, all of us, to seize on them. So I'm really looking forward to our future discussions and see how we can pack some of those with my panelists, as also during the Q&A with the audience. Thanks so much, Michelle.
Thank you, Lorraine. And David.
Hello, everybody. Thanks first to ICoCA for including me today and focusing in particular on this really important and critical topic of women, peace, and security. And it's an honor to be here with this esteemed panel of experts. So looking forward to the Q&A as we get to some great questions I already see popping up in the chat and the Q&A here. So my focus is a little bit different, and I'm an academic and I also work with industry. And I'm going to focus on the industry side of this a little bit today. Although, again, the academic side of what I do as a professor, I think, is important in terms of educating our senior leaders who are going to go out there and implement the Women, Peace, and Security Act. But I want to talk to the private sector for just a minute here today as we have this time. So I'm here in my role as representing myself and not the Navy War College or our government today. So these comments are based off of my background. So the research I've been doing over the last decade with my colleague and co-author, Dr. Brad Johnson, who's at the U.S. Naval Academy, has focused broadly on engaging men in this idea around why we need to be working on gender equity and why this needs to be important in our work. And as much as, like Sahana said earlier, that this is not a women's issue, even though in the title of Women, Peace, and Security, is to integrate that. This is a leadership issue, which means men and women need to be involved in addressing this. Again, as Sahana said, I think the business case for this is really critical in terms of operational effectiveness. And we see this in the research over and over again, and it continues to pile up across industries today, that the more gender diverse you are across leadership, and this is all the way from the top to the bottom, whether it's your board, your C-suite, all the way down to your middle and frontline managers, the people who are actually implementing this, that you're more effective, you're more likely to accomplish your mission. If you measure your bottom line in terms of profits and losses, which a lot of you do, and that's important too, right? That part of the economy that, again, you need to have more gender diversity across the board. It's also important from a very broad perspective, and I just like to highlight some of the research at Our Secure Future that they found in terms of the broader national outcomes and global outcomes. And this, again, I think is critical to why we as men need to be involved in this work as well, is that, again, when women are more involved, and we see this today even during the pandemic, the countries where women leaders are organizing and working to eliminate the pandemic or at least reduce its effects right now are having much greater success. And we certainly find that in the peace and stability world as well, where peace agreements are much more likely to last. We find more stability. We find, again, better health outcomes out there when, again, women are involved everywhere from this. This goes from creating and writing policy to negotiating agreements to implementing out there, boots on the ground. And so we have to have women's representation all the way across the board. That's not going to happen without men being involved too. Why? Because men are more often the decision makers and positions of power and influence and controllers of the purse strings and resources, and are out there making the decisions. And we have to, again, be thinking about this. However, one of the challenges we find is that men are reluctant to engage or to talk about these topics. And there's a host of reasons out there, and we can go into more detail if you're interested later. But at the end of the day, it's really about seeing the problem and seeing why men have a role in this in particular. And a lot of times men, they may understand and they may say that they're all about increasing gender equality and eliminating gender inequities, but we don't find that the action matches the language or the words out there. So we've got to get beyond this little bit of a gap out there. The other thing is that some men may look at this as a social experiment, and it's not. It's not an experiment. This is about social justice. It's about real world outcomes that affect families, individual lives, and countries, and peace and stability. And we've got to take this seriously. One of the other reasons that men don't get involved is we often are uncomfortable talking about this. And so when it comes to gender or relationships or gender dynamics, we often will be on the sidelines because we're just not comfortable talking about these topics. one of the things that helps us to get involved in the work, and the research shows us that when we have the motivation to do the work, that we're much more likely to be involved. And that motivation often comes through our own personal connections to the issues. So seeing gender inequities affect different people in our lives, different people in our country, and various relationships that we have often gets in touch with that sense of justice and fairness that we have and motivates us to do the work. The other part of it is that sometimes it's useful to, again, see how it affects our business. So again, for those of you in the private sector out there, you do have a connection to this through your business, and seeing how it can affect or help enhance your business and make you more profitable, make you more creative or innovative. Again, these are things that are useful for everyone out there. And at the end of the day, as we learn to talk about this topic, we need to connect it to the mission. And whether you have a personal connection through somebody in your family or in your personal life, you need to learn how to talk about it in terms of how it connects to getting the mission done and getting it done better. The last thing I would say is we're getting into understanding how do we approach this as leaders, that we have to have a little bit of humility about what we know and what we don't know. And often in this case as men, that we don't really necessarily understand all the implications of this. And this is a time for us to be asking questions, to self-educate, to become more aware of the challenges, and talk to our female colleagues about how we can improve in these areas out there. I would say that, along the way, this is really about allyship, and allyship is a journey, and that we're going to make mistakes. We're not perfect, and we're going to make mistakes along the way, and to take ownership of those and learn from them, and then move on from that. Finally, allyship is really a form of leadership. These are particular skill sets that we can develop and we can train to. And so again, I think there's room for this from either a certification process or a training process or just a leader development education process in your company. And we can think about it in three ways. Leaders need to, one, be more clear about why this is important and be able to communicate that message throughout their organization. If you as a leader can't communicate that, others will not take it as being important, and they're probably not going to abide by those rules. The second piece is transparency, so critical to implementing something like Women, Peace, and Security Act. If we're not transparent about it, it becomes another diversity initiative. And what happens with those? These are these little hush-hush, don't talk loudly about this, these secrets that we have, like it's a dirty little secret and we're trying to hide it. No, we have to be transparent about it. Talk about how we're doing, what the goals are, why it's important to our business, why it's important to our countries out there, and then show how we're doing, show the progress and talk about it. Because again, we're not always going to be 100%. We've got to continue to work on this and developing and improving at it. And the last piece, and you heard, again, Sahana mention this, and I think this is really important. I'm going to say it again: accountability at every level of your organization, from the CEO, the board, all the way to your frontline managers. If we don't hold people accountable for doing the work, find ways to measure the progress and evaluate people on it and put the resources to it, we're never going to get there. So thank you, and I look forward to our conversation today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, David. Now, I'll bit of a vignette, but and kind of brag on a company. At ICoCA, when we stood up this WPS certification program, as I mentioned, so a lot of entities signed up. A lot have proceeded down this path of receiving training and attending specific WPS type events. One of the earliest recipients, kind of charging toward the gate to receive full certification, was KBR. So a lot of us who work in high threat theaters and all around the world are familiar with KBR. They received this certification, but what I was so delighted by was the level of their level of pride in receipt of this certification. Really a sense of achievement they put, and not just kind of, let's get some business out of this. Their C-suite level actually then built a set of slides and made the theme of one of their ELTs, their executive leadership team. They made the theme WPS as a law, as an imperative, not a suggestion, not a nicety. Byron said, no, I'm pulling together my executive leadership team, and now we're briefing this issue and how it is corporately we've received this certification. But what does it mean when we drive it through our entire organization? So I was thrilled to hear that, because otherwise, as you say, sometimes it can get sidetracked as kind of a nicety or a woman's thing, and it doesn't go anywhere. So I want to ask everyone else, because David kind of touched on this, or he not only touched this, I think he's answered this already, but if the rest of you can weigh in, and in some ways we almost do need to bring this. I know it benefits me when I get things brought to my attention at the second grade level. That way I know how to crawl, walk, run, right? So what do you think can be done to better ensure representation of women in decision-making and governance structures across all sectors? And then, as David kind of already opined, what are the risks of not incorporating a gender perspective? So thank you for any of you who would like to lead on that.
I'd be happy to take a, so, I've been in the 25 years that I've been in this field and working across governments in the UN and others. A lot of my time I was working on not only training Department of Political Affairs or Department of Peacekeeping Operations at the UN, but actually helping them unpack in very practical ways what it means for them to do this work, right? And if you take, I remember going into DPKO, as it was called in those days, and having to meet clusters of people, their police, their military, the logistic guys, right? So how do you talk to the logistic guys about what it means to do WPS? There's no point talking to them about bringing down the patriarchy or, that's just, it's not tangible. But if you say to them, logistic, what do you have to do? If you are setting up the peacekeeping operations in a new country, have you thought about the fact that there are female peacekeepers? Where do they sleep? Where do they go to the bathroom? How many latrines do you need? I mean, for some people, it's as basic as that. Have you got, we've heard of stories where the size of the uniform isn't the right size for women. The shoes aren't the right size, basic things like this, right? So that's one thing. Now, next question. We say, why does diversity matter? Right, beyond making it just, a rhetorical thing. I can tell you that, again, in my experience, as I've traveled around the world working on these issues, I have been in places where people have seen my Allah, because I'm Iranian by heritage and my uncle gave me this Allah, and they've zoned in on it and said, you're Muslim. We can talk to you, and so that becomes an identity question. I've been in places, I remember being in South Africa, meeting military personnel and it was a senior general, and then there was a woman officer, and she was very stiff in the meeting, and then we started walking together, and something happened, and I said, I have children. Automatically, that question of what it means to be a mother and working and being in the security spaces or going into sort of supposedly fragile or dangerous places, being away from home, traveling, there was a connection there. Nepal, same thing. They thought I was some sort of alien from outside. The minute I mentioned what it means to work, it's another connection. Afghanistan, I was sitting with a group of men talking about peace and security issues, speaking to them in Dari because I speak Farsi. And we're talking about, the Afghan Peace Council and the plan. And I said, well, in Somalia, they did this and they did that. And eventually I asked them, I was like, what do you guys think? And one chap sitting next to me said, you're kind of little, but you know a lot. What do you think, right? And what was fascinating for me was that in Afghanistan, especially, I as a woman, and I can sit with a group of women and I can sit and talk to them about everything. And then I can go sit with a group of men. And the men, at some point, maybe I'd walked in and they expected me to be 6'5" and some big person, who knows, but they see that it was disarming for them. It reduces the tension and the kind of whether it's sort of, subconscious, unconscious male ego type, but I talk to them on a human level. When I engage, I talk about their children. I don't know how often men in the security or in the diplomatic sphere in these high tense situations can face each other and say, hey, what do you want for your kids? I can do that. It's my strategy. It's a tactic. So the question, and my bringing back this question of diversity, is that when you have a diverse team of tall and short and different colors and different ethnicities and different language skills and so forth, you actually have the best access to wherever it is that you're being deployed to engage. Different people have different, it's bringing the comparative strength of each person to the table to move on. So there's a real added value of what you understand and how people talk to you. In Somalia, I was sitting in negotiations, and there was a minister of ports or tourism or something, I didn't know what to say. I was, as I'm making conversation, I said, you have a beautiful coastline, Indian Ocean. It's fantastic. It must be amazing to go diving here, And he turned around to me and he said, oh, you're Iranian. If you bring wealthy Iranians here to invest, you can have all the land you want. Now, I was working for the United Nations, so this chap didn't, as far as I was concerned, I was like, this is a sign of corruption, right? Let's be honest. But he felt so comfortable with me because, we're from the same part of the world, or that, he thinks that he kind of said this stuff. Again, I don't know whether he would necessarily say that to an American. The conversation with an American might be slightly different, So I'm just, what I'm saying is that the diversity allows us different access and different ways of thinking about it, giving empathy and being in different shoes. So it adds value to the way that we're doing so. In terms of the question of, whether women can get in or not, in all the years that I've worked, it never occurred to me that we shouldn't work. We always worked with men. Of course you have to work with men. But the truth of it is, as David was saying, is that number one, it is men who opt out of this discourse. I was looking at the list of attendees to see what percentage of men you had, right? We always do events. And what we found is that if you put the word gender or women in the title, the men don't show up. If you say alternative, new perspectives on security, they'll come. But if you say, oh, women's perspectives or gender, why gender matters, they don't show up. And it's a really missed opportunity, because the reality is that the gender lens that we talk about, I did I've done a lot of the women, peace and security work and what women have done on the ground and working with women. But I also did a 10-country study for UNDP some years ago on the role of men and why men become vulnerable to recruitment into militias and to violence. And what is it? How do we pull them out? How do you make them resilient? So this lens of gender gives you also the story of men. We've had programs in Afghanistan where our local partners are leading. We've helped them design it, where for the first time ever, they brought imams and village district chiefs and teachers to sit in a room and be asked the question, what does it feel like to be a boy, to be a teenager, to be a young man, to be an old man in the middle of violence? How do you feel? The humanity of men is something that this agenda has helped us bring out. And you can bring that conversation all the way up to the highest levels in the international sphere as well. But we need the guys to engage. And we also need men to join us in the conversation around violence against women, around sexual violence. Number one, sexual violence happens against men and women. But number two, we know from the research and from all the facts around us that it is predominantly men who are involved in sexual violence or forms of violence against women. It may be a minority of men that are giving the rest of the good guys a bad name. But this is not a women's issue. This is the perpetrators of violence. We need men to engage with other men and talk about this stuff, right? We can help, but putting the burden on women to deal with the violence that they're experiencing is really unfair. So we really need men to be part of the solutions. And again, and finally, just examples of really simple stuff. If you have the private security industry that is active in these spaces, being a role model in terms of its hires and its diversity of staff, being a role model in terms of how it engages with the local communities and doing it respectfully and showing dignity and showing that you are there to protect, your role is there to protect civilian life as well. That sends a huge message to the police and the other security actors that are there and possibly the ones that you're training. You can be a critical role model in all of this. And finally, in the diplomacy and the bureaucratic world, the notion of incentives and competition and so is very different to the private sector. Private sector, you guys know that if you don't abide by the rules, you're not going to get the contract, right? So there's an element of incentives. There's an element of KBR wanting to be better than the next guy in the sector, right? This is really important in terms of changing behavior because the incentive is there. There's a financial incentive or what a reputational incentive. So that changes the behavior, and that behavior change can then change the way that the industry works. And I think bringing some of that into the public sector is really, really important because public sector, the incentives are unclear and there's no punishment. There's no punitive, there's no downside to a senior UN or senior official in the government actually not taking this agenda on board seriously. They just move on to the, every 3 years they get cycled in and out of the next job. So we need to bring an element of that to hold them accountable. But I think the private sector being a push behind and saying this matters, and also being a voice with the advocacy community, it really helps when you have this diversity. And let's get rid of the kind of the issue of gender, racism and sexism as barriers to the benefit of everybody and to the benefit of the companies that you're working with.
Absolutely, Sanam. And I'll weigh in. I'll work with any carrots and sticks I need to. And I think I'd mentioned as we were staging on this, I have supported a company that has multiple active U.S. Embassy Guard Force contracts across the world. And we've seen again and again that when our Guard Force, our local guards, armed or unarmed, when the local guards protecting an embassy, when the Guard Force itself is comprised of about 50% women, we have a much higher level of morale. We have lower levels of attrition. We have higher levels of retention. We have a real embracing of receipt of new trainings and skills and opportunities to advance. As a result, I spend less on recruiting, vetting, screening, identification of new candidates because my workforce is very stable and very proud of the work that they do. And at the end of the day, does that hit bottom line on profitability on a local Guard Force contract? It absolutely does. We do this for the right reasons, but does it affect private sector in that way also? Yes. And so I think, I like to encourage government as it writes its RFPs and its statements of work to consider that also, to get this driven through into PWS or SAL requirements, because industry will pay attention, at least at a minimum, because they want to bid that work, win that work, execute that work, and be profitable. So thank you. We've got great questions, and I also want to say thank you. There's Jonah and Ian and Caleb. There are several in our chat. There are lots of fellows saying, I'm one of the guys, I'm one of the guys. So we're really privileged to have this entire audience here today. And thank you, because it's to that point. It's only going to work when we collaborate and we are all in the room and engaged. So thank you all. So I want to ask Sahana and Lorraine to answer this question. I can repeat it if you'd like me to, but then after that, let's go to the questions that are coming from the audience, because we're down to about 15 minutes left. Okay. So if you, Lorraine and Sahana,
sure.
You remember the question? I know.
You might want to repeat it.
I do. I'm happy to.
Go ahead, Lorraine. Okay.
Okay.
So it was,
so I just want to touch on a couple of points that were already.
Okay.
No, you please go ahead. Repeat the question, and then I'll respond.
Okay. So the question was, what can be done to better ensure representation of women in decision-making and governance structures across all sectors? And what are the risks of not incorporating a gender perspective? Thank you.
Okay, no problem. I think a lot of the points that I would have raised have already been raised. And so I'm going to underscore and add a little bit. And also, I might have a different perspective in terms of accountability in government that I think I'll share as well. And I think, as David and others have mentioned, that leadership commitment and modeling is super important. That alone, of course, is not going to get us to where we want to be, but it's an important element. And in terms of the accountability, I don't know that I would agree that there's no accountability for the public sector in terms of moving forward on this agenda. I think that goes back to the leadership. If at the highest level you have a commitment to moving this forward, the question then becomes, what tools do you have to those who are responsible day to day to move this forward? What tools do they have? And do they feel confident in order to doing that? And I think that goes back to the need to make sure that I'm not just talking about guidance tools, et cetera, but the analysis that we're doing to get the information that's needed in order to move forward on the agenda. What does that look like? And in Canada, we have what's called a GBA Plus, which is Gender-Based Analysis Plus, which is an analytical process by which we look at all those factors that I had mentioned and others have mentioned before, the intersectionality piece. And that is not, doing that does not mean you're automatically going to advance the agenda. But within government, I think it also could be useful too for industry as well. It's a framework of analysis that gives you information upon which you can then utilize to move forward at the agenda. And I think one of the key things that we have to realize too is that why don't we ask women what are some of the barriers? What information, what are they saying is preventing them from effectively coming to the table? And so one of the things that I wanted to highlight is that most recently, I think it was last week, the International Peace Institute published a research paper. It's funded through the ELSI initiative, which is an initiative that Canada leads on women in peacekeeping. It's called Women First, Soldiers Second, Taboos and Stigmas Facing Military Women in Peace Operations. And basically what it is they asked 142 military women from 53 countries, what are the barriers for you? And then the information that came from that, for example, I don't think any of that's going to be surprising to any of us: discrimination, racism, sexual harassment, assault, gender stereotypes, etc. And the reason why I raise that, not so much in the specific study in and of itself, but the question is, who are we asking what the barriers are, and making sure that we're asking the right people, and also learning from COVID, I would think. So much of the research that's been done on how the impact of COVID, the disproportionate impact this has had on women, what are the opportunities and their organizations? For example, the simple issue of just providing childcare support to allow women to participate at these tables can have a profound impact. So, and I can't stop without saying something about funding. The Secretary General has indicated that one of the gaps that we're facing in moving the agenda forward is the lack of funding for women peace builders. And there is ongoing work on how we can equitably do so. I just came across my desk just the other day that apparently the Kroc Institute for Peace and Justice is undertaking a study with regard to this. And I'm not very familiar with it, but I think I like the initiative is to look at how are we creating equitable funding partnerships among all of the sectors to move forward to ensure that we can fill that funding gap to allow women peace builders individually and as organizations or networks to be able to move forward. I think to me the question of what are the risks are, given what we know about the success of peace negotiations and their outcomes and their sustainability when we have women effectively participating in those negotiations. The question for me is like, how could we not do so? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Sahana, do you have a quick response there, or would you like me to go to questions?
Well, I can jump in and actually, I think actually that question to me relates to a lot of questions I'm seeing in the chat box and
Okay.
Q&A. So I might sort of tie them a bit together in my response. Well, first, I mean, everyone's talked about this issue of diversity, discrimination, et cetera. But to ensure, in my view, I think we have to address the problem structurally, but also 2 points to ensure women's better representation in security decision-making. I think when we have done studies on asking women, what are your barriers to entry? There are a few out there, and we do know that there are real barriers to entry that we are just not addressing. Like, we are getting answers and we're not doing anything about them. We're also not addressing the hard questions about what is happening when you're grooming the pipeline of women to come into the security sector. Where do they drop off? Why are they dropping off? They are telling us why they're dropped off. Why they're dropping off: household chores, discrimination they face daily, harassment they face daily, low pay, blah, 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 right? We know the answers. We just aren't doing anything about it. If we want a female force commander or a female head of a private security force, we have to get that person in the system to have a career long enough to be nominated to become that force commander or that female head of a private security force. So that person, that group of people actually needs more attention in terms of not just recruitment, but retention and really addressing those barriers to entry. And someone had asked about the role of toxic masculinities and addressing all this. I think, yeah, absolutely. Like, we're talking about the security sector. It's a very male-dominated environment, right? So obviously we have different identities when it comes to masculinity, and toxic masculinity has been one of the great, motivators and purveyors of security, right? So we have to address that. And I think one of the ways that we can do that is understanding that how do we do gender equality, or how do we get to it, is actually a critical analysis skill set. It is actually a thing that you do, that you don't theorize about. And the practical things that both, that everybody has talked about, Sanam and David and Lorraine has talked about in very concrete ways, those are things you actually need to do in order to address toxic masculinities in the strategic level, operational level, tactical levels. I would say structurally, well, on the risks part, you risk reputation, you risk operational success, you have financial risks, but also we risk lives, right? We risk the peace, really, if we don't get this right and we don't work together. So just a couple of ideas for structural tools and tactics, and it really kind of also addressing a question that was about why don't governments actually issue contracts for women, peace and security, specifically security related efforts. I think it's because our government partners haven't really thought about it yet, right? Like they see the problem, and the narrative that we have around security issues is predominantly a victim narrative. We haven't leveraged the part of women, peace and security that talks about women's agency in solving the problem, right? So how do we address that structurally? I think going back to something Michelle said, contracts, how are contracts written? How is procurement done? Can private military or private security firms do gender audits on their corporations? Can ICoCA really consider establishing some kind of certification process where we can help companies quantify their corporate commitments to gender so they have them on entry into a company or country and on exit from a country, documenting where they're really strong at things and where there's weaknesses. I don't think this is a problem one sector can solve by itself. I think we have to pull our ideas and resources together to really get the innovative approaches and how to address these really complicated issues.
Can I just add a couple of points to this? When I was in South Africa, South Africa back after apartheid, women basically led a national process, national review, defense review, because the defense companies came in and said, we need new submarines and new tanks. And women in parliament who had been in the armed movement of the ANC said, why do we need submarines? What's the definition of security? What do people define as security? And they led a 3-year national defense review. And they went out and people said, well, insecurity comes from not having street lights. Insecurity comes from having uranium depletion in the soil and in the water. It comes from poverty. It comes from HIV/AIDS. It was a very human security oriented lens. And they reframed the national security side of it. But one of the things that they struggled with was that how do you take a military security sector that was predominantly not only white and minority, but very much of the apartheid regime, right? And integrate it. How do you make people feel and bring all the diversity? I remember talking to one of the generals about this, and he said, one of the hardest things is how do you make the culture of the institution welcoming to diversity? And he meant it both in terms of saying, when you're bringing people from 13 different tribes and languages, and that's one side of it. But if people have if people have different funeral rights, right? So that if your mother passes away, you need to go for a week and you need to be away, and the institution doesn't respect that we have different needs, then people leave because they don't feel at home in that space. It's the same with women. Working in the UN system, so often the question would be, well, at 6 o'clock in the evening, the boss opens his door and everybody can go in and have a drink and chit chat about how the day went. But guess what? Most women don't do that because they're going home because they've got the wife, they've got kids and other responsibilities. So you have to make a conscious effort to open up alternative spaces for that informal networking that goes on, right? How do you make sure that really the culture of the organization is conducive to these? When I started working here in the US, one of the things, my children were young, and I said, well, I'm traveling. It costs a lot to get extra childcare. We ended up instituting a dog and child care policy because we had a senior lady who had a dog and the dog needs to go in the kennel. But you could expand this, like elderly, domestic care that you have. What happens when you need to go away? How does the company help and enable providing these things so that it's not, the burden isn't on women? The men in the company benefited enormously because they had their wife at home with, if their wives were at home work, and saying stay-at-home moms, the money helped them in whatever ways they wanted. For me, it was incredibly helpful. So it's, lots of companies give gym membership. Why not give childcare membership? There's so many different ways that you can unpack it to make it conducive for people to be there. Having said this, when you get to senior levels, there aren't 55 positions. It does become competitive, and it does become a place where you have to be conscious about the unconscious bias that is driving recruitment and driving seniority. And we're seeing that in the public sector, we're seeing that in the finance world, all sorts of kind of nuanced forms of sexism and racism that right now are there. And the sooner companies engage in these conversations and address them, the better it is for them, because it's better for their bottom line, but it's also reputationally the place that people want to come and work and they'll benefit. And I think that certainly I know of cases where there's a lot of resistance to actually admitting that there's a bit of a problem. But you look at the senior manager, even if they have a female leader, you look at the senior management, it's 80% men, and women are still kept at some other glass ceiling level. And women of color especially have this problem. Lean In and McKinsey have done studies on this, and they show that. So it doesn't have to be an adversarial, it's not a zero-sum kind of conversation. It really is opening it up and thinking about it and just allowing also the good guys to have, there's a lot of conversation about the good guys. Good guys hate toxic masculinity as well. Good men were also bullied by people like Harvey Weinstein or whatever his name was. None of us want that kind of leadership. So the more all of us speak out, the more we can elevate the idea of good leadership and goodness and caring and commitment to everybody being the standard bearer as opposed to being a bully, basically.
Thank you, Sanam. I'm going to respond to one quick question and then ask our secretariat if we can continue longer or whether we should make this another day, another conversation. But I saw that someone had said, why do we have no male speaker from PSC here today? So a PSC is a private security contractor. And I will say humbly that I think I might be a bit of a success story. I have been working in private security contracting for almost 20 years. And bringing my lens, my perspectives, I'm a mother of 5. I've got 4 daughters. I care an awful lot about the ethical and transparent and superior provision of security services across the globe where contractors are needed and required. And often they bolt up side to side. In fact, our Department of Defense in the United States counts the contracting community in its headcount of the total force, right? So it is a male-dominated industry. And yet they've made place for little old Michelle Quinn. And at ICoCA, I actually hold the Americas seat. So for Canada, North America, Central and South America, I'm the representative for the security industry. It's a privilege. Any of you, please feel free to reach out to me with any questions, concerns, or comments. On another day, we could have more male speakers from this industry, and it wouldn't be hard to identify those and bring them forward. But it's kind of my background. It's a privilege to be representing this industry. Chris, I know it's 11:35. We're a little over an hour now. Can we continue with one more question, or should we wrap this up and hope for another forum where we can continue this conversation?
If the panelists have time, I'd carry on.
Okay, so there's one question that's been out. James had asked, I think it's a great question. What are the recommendations of the panelists for negotiating with groups that are violently suppressing women's education? And maybe let's push that a little bit further. We've got a specific example, our frustrations right now, or the peace process that is underway in Afghanistan, with all the real challenges of the engagement and the inclusion and the security of the women of Afghanistan. So anyone thoughts on that, what your recommendations might be?
That's a $1 million question, I think. Oh, I wish Sanam stayed on. She would be really perfect to be able to answer that question since she has such direct experience with the, oh, there she's back again. Oh, there she is.
Sanam, did you hear that question? Would you like to respond?
How to negotiate with groups that want to suppress girls' education? Yeah. I'll give you, I can give you some practical examples of this. So number one, it's really important to know what logic they're using to do that, right? So for example, if Boko Haram or the Taliban claims that Islam is telling us that girls shouldn't be educated, what you need to do is to have people who understand Islam and who know that one of the first tenets of the Quran is that everybody needs to be, education is like a Muslim duty, right? Men and women, girls and boys. So you need to kind of engage in their space and challenge them in their own kind of ideology in a way. And what we found is that in Pakistan, in Nigeria, in Afghanistan, in all of these places, when you bring women to engage directly with those groups, and and especially like in Nigeria, we have an at ICAN, we run an independent fund for women peace builders called the Innovative Peace Fund. And very early on in 2015, we supported our Nigerian partner who said that she was an Islamic scholar. She wanted to work with local Islamic scholars and teachers around principles of peace building and gender equality as they intersected with Islam. And we helped her do this and then bring it to local radio. So she would have these Muslim scholars and teachers on the local radio in local language for 15 weeks. People could call in and ask questions. And after that 15-week period, there was a 40% increase in school enrollment in that area, in Maiduguri, which is in northern Nigeria. She's been engaging with women who end up joining Boko Haram or girls that have been abducted and being part of that. And one of the things that they say, ironically, and this is interesting, is that in Boko Haram, they've been taught to read the Quran at least. In their own villages, they had zero access to literacy. So this brings it back to the question of, well, what was the government doing? Where's all the development aid? Where's all the oil money that Nigeria has to actually enable education? Imagine what it must be like to think that in the context of Boko Haram, you have a better chance of fulfilling your sense of dignity as a girl or as a woman than in that community outside. But these are the kinds of things that we see. We've done the same thing in Liberia, in Libya. We've had partners in Pakistan. There's constantly this exchange. And right now, again, with Afghanistan, it's the same thing. What we're saying is bring women peace builders to Qatar to talk directly with the Taliban themselves from a very human experience and human lens. I was talking to somebody just earlier before we had this call, and they were saying that the most interesting conversations is when the 4 women that are in the government delegation get to speak directly to the Taliban. So as outsiders, as Westerners, we have to step back. We constantly think that, again, as a Muslim, we constantly go, oh, Islam is the Islam of the Taliban. Islam is the Islam of ISIS. No, that's a very extreme version of this faith that has actually been spread around the world by Saudi Arabia. It's Wahhabism. And we have to push back. And if we don't feel comfortable in engaging in that space of discourse of religious texts, bring the experts, bring the women who know this stuff and let them face off. Bring the male scholars, right? And let them do it. So it's kind of like being able to talk, your own context, allow the people that are local to talk locally. This I think is one of the most important lessons that we have, and it is transformative on all levels when we see it. Thank you.
Absolutely. And I will say, on speaking for the US government, this is one of the reasons that WPS becoming a law, right, enforcing some of these issues forward. When our COCOM commanders have gender advisors, right, then the gender advisors know in that theater that they've got to go to the watering hole, that they've got to walk the path with women who are collecting firewood. They've got to be listening to those women because those women are early indicators of violent extremism. They know what's happening in their families. They often have a huge ability to influence their sons, their brothers, their fathers, right? And so, and when we put it that way, it's like, oh yeah, that's pretty basic. We think about the roles of women in most of our lives, and we get that behind the scenes, a wise mother or grandmother can influence and shape an awful lot. And that we are talking on WPS imperatives, we are talking about advancing the human condition. And so, it's true, not a feminist thing, a broader issue. So I want to thank everyone. I know we're quite a bit over. I want to thank the ICoCA Secretariat. This was a wonderful discussion. The hour and almost hour and 15 minutes passed way too fast. I know we have an annual General Assembly that is forthcoming in December. And I saw in one of the comments that someone was saying they would like this issue brought up, and maybe we can at the AGA this year. And that is, parts of it are open to the public. In December, when ICoCA has its AGA, it will also be a celebration of the 10-year anniversary of the International Code of Conduct, which is a compelling document to read. It's got real standards, exacting standards, and specific mandates for all of us that are things that really matter. So maybe Chris and the ICoCA team can put out a link to that part of the AGA that will include the celebration of the International Code of Conduct and a link to the keynote speaker. I think we have planned for that. So, in any case, so David, thank you. Sahana, thank you. Lorraine, thank you. Sanam, thank you. And for everyone who joined in and stuck through this more than an hour, it's just been a privilege. Thank you for being with us today, and hope you have a great rest of your day, rest of your week. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks.